Good morning. Hello. Thanks for joining us. This is going to be just kind of an interview talking with two very interesting people in the tech community here in New York City. We have Eliot Horowitz, CTO of MongoDB. Thanks for joining us. Hey. And Alan Johnson, a software engineer at Artsy, which is a startup. Cool. Could you guys just introduce yourselves and tell us what you do and what you're working on?
Sure. So MongoDB is an open source document database. Mm-hmm. It is, different than traditional databases for, two main reasons. One main reason is the way that you store data in MongoDB is a little bit more natural, and it's take this out. It's using a document format. And the reason why we did it is sort of the most interesting thing is we did it because we wanted to make developers more productive, right? We found that for ourselves that using old databases anything was possible, but it took too much effort. And we wanted to make it easier for people to write software using databases that was interesting. And we wanted to make it possible to do that in sort of modern environments where people care about real time, where people care about things being spread across the globe, where people care about things scaling very quickly. And so we've been doing that for about 8.5 years now.
Very cool, thanks.
My name's Alan Johnson. I work for a company called Artsy. Artsy is a platform for art. We are both a source of information and education for the art world, as well as a platform for art commerce. So we partner with the world's leading galleries, museums, institutions, auction houses to bring art online and make it accessible in a climate where art has traditionally been something that only people who are moneyed or privileged can access.
Gotcha. So trying to bring it down so everybody can buy cool art.
Yeah, buy, learn about, explore, everything.
Cool. And I didn't introduce myself. I'm Devindra Hardawar. I'm a reporter at Engadget. I write about phones and all sorts of technology. I've been exploring VR for the past couple of weeks, so we can talk about that later. But guys, I just want to ask you, how did you get started in the tech community? And what's your background and what led you to New York?
So I'll try and compress my voyage. So
you don't have to. No, I think, and the thing talking to kids last year, everyone's really interested in hearing that. So
sure.
Explain.
So I got my start when I got my TI-83 graphing calculator when I was 12. I learned how to program that. I learned how to put games on it. But then I realized most of the games are written in assembly language. So I started teaching myself how to program in assembly for my graphing calculator, and that proved to be kind of like the gateway into really learning how to code in middle school and high school. When I was looking into going to college, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to actually do post-college, but I knew that I knew how to program, so studying computer engineering seemed like a good idea to me. I went from there to grad school. I studied computer engineering at Iowa State University. I went from there to study grad school at Princeton University in electrical engineering, around which time I was starting to burn out a little bit on some of the software work I'd done up until that point, because I worked for a number of companies that weren't, I guess I would say they weren't super aligned with the things that I was interested in as a person necessarily. So I kind of changed directions a bit. I joined Teach for America, and I taught high school math in Baltimore for 2 years. Kind of after 2 years, I realized that probably wasn't the road for me either. And that's what brought me here to New York City. I did another graduate program at NYU in music technology because I figured I still know how to program, but I want to do things that actually excite me. So the idea of studying music technology allowed me to kind of marry the skills that I had in software with kind of my deep interest in music. And that kind of embedded me here in New York City about 6 years ago. Coming out of that program, I started a company with a friend from the music business program at NYU. It was a startup in music, kind of like fantasy sports for music. It was a cool idea, but we didn't really have any money to pull it off.
What was the name?
It's called Breakers.
I remember that.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, that was cool.
Yeah. So yeah, it was a good experience, and it was incredible education. We didn't really have the resources to pull it off, so I ended up going from there to a company called the Hackerati, through which I contracted for HuffPost. which is a sister company to Engadget. I worked there for 2 years before making the transition to Artsy, where I'm at now, last summer.
Excellent. Eliot, what was your journey like?
Yeah, so I started programming when I was pretty young. My father was interested in writing games, and I started writing games when I was pretty young. And then I kind of lost interest in it for about a decade or so, mostly because there's other things to do outside.
Sure.
And then picked it up back again, like at the end of high school, kind of just for fun, kind of to take, because I thought it would look good on a resume for college. So I was like, I should do this again, and started liking it again. Went to college, wasn't expecting to do CS, but took a couple of CS classes because I knew it was kind of fun, and decided I kind of like this again, and started programming pretty heavily in college. And then so after college, or in college before I graduated, I was really very unsure of what I was going to do after college. I applied for a whole bunch of different things all over the map, including a bunch of programming jobs in New York. And at the end, the programming jobs in New York seemed way more appealing than anything else. So that's how I ended up in New York. And so I worked for a company called DoubleClick for a couple of years, which eventually...
Does anybody know what DoubleClick is?
So anyone know what pop-up ads are? Yeah, those annoying things. Yeah, so DoubleClick invented pop-up ads in 1996 or so, and then all the other evil internet advertising technology between 1996 and now largely comes out of that group. So I worked there for a couple of years, decided it wasn't really for me, and then in 2005 I started a company called ShopWiki. And ShopWiki was interesting because the technology was really cool, because we crawled the entire internet looking for things to buy. So very interesting software, very interesting sort of machine learning problems, terrible business because Amazon sort of owns the internet. And a couple years later decided that, in every challenge I've ever faced as an engineer, the databases were actually the most interesting part to me and the hardest part, and thought we could actually do something a little bit better. So then in 2007, 2008, we started MongoDB and have been, working on that ever since.
Gotcha. So I tried to do some programming in college, and I kind of got away from CS, but I'm still in the tech world. There is hope, folks. Databases aren't normally the most exciting thing, but a lot of my friends and my programming friends, they love Mongo. They love a lot of the other new database things. Can you tell me, could you boil it down, what makes it interesting compared to, what people were using before Mongo?
So there is no one who uses a database whose focus and interest is in using that database. Right? People are only using a database because they want to do something else, whether it's, doing something in the art world or doing something in the medical world or doing something in the education world. There's always something else they're trying to actually do, and they have to use the database. I think you would probably agree. You don't actually, using the database is not the fun part of the job. Using the database is the part you have to do what you actually care about doing. And so our entire purpose is to make working with a database easier, less painful, and sort of to get out of the way of your actual job. So, people like MongoDB, because, again, our job is to make them more productive and to make their lives less painful when working with databases. And if we do that, they end up a lot happier because they end up focusing on what they care about. And we end up happy because we actually make them productive and do what we set out to do.
Very nice. Cool. Has anyone here, have you guys worked with databases yet, or programming any of those things? Have you guys used Mongo yet? Okay. Cool. Well, you can check out Mongo next. Yeah. Alan, I was interested, you talked about using your programming skills for music technology, and that's that's just very different after getting burned out of the startup world. Could you talk more about that and kind of how you approach that? Because I think that's interesting. Maybe if you're not as interested in programming to become a programmer, there's a lot of ways you could use those skills, right?
Yeah, I'd say that right now is a really interesting time kind of in the tech world, because the real explosion in tech has been in marrying technology with other fields, whether that's music, fashion, art, anything really. I don't know if there's anything in particular that I don't know that you want me to dig into, but.
Well, I'm wondering, it's interesting that you talk about getting a little burned out from the startup. So maybe talk about that, and also what interested you in bringing those skills to music tech and kind of what you did there.
Yeah, actually, I would say the time that I burned out was before I started my startup coming out of the music tech program.
Okay.
But yeah, I think when I look back on sort of my life since I can really remember, since I became a teenager, the two things that are probably most constant are music and programming. and tech in general. And so when I was really kind of coming out of teaching and, having had, a long tech adventure and a long teaching adventure and not really being sure what was next up for me, I really wanted to do something I could be truly excited about. I kind of went in thinking that I wanted to develop effects for guitar or I don't know, the things that I was really familiar with. But I went in also open to the fact that in the 2 years I'd be in the program, I'd probably discover a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't even really know existed, which turned out to be the case. It turned out that there was a really vibrant research effort in what they call music information retrieval, which is kind of like machine learning as applied to music. So if you have raw audio and you want to extract the sheet music for it, or you want to do something like Shazam where you can identify a song with your phone just over the microphone of the phone. There's a lot of interesting problems there. And so I really got engrossed in some of these hard technical problems that people want to use as they look for ways to make music accessible in various ways. And I think music is sort of at the forefront of that kind of thing, whether it's like Shazam or whether you have software that lets people make music in more interesting ways by sampling and, so I think what's kind of interesting about being in art now is that it's traditionally lagged a lot of the other media, whether that's like print media or music. So we get to kind of solve some of those problems for, the first time, whereas music has a very deep tradition of technology.
Gotcha. What would your advice be for both you guys? Two kids today, what to focus on, and also, I guess second part of this question: put yourselves in the shoes. What would you personally do if you could, do a Freaky Friday thing and be young again and start from today? Yeah, go ahead.
That's like a tease. So, I think the key for me is, at least what worked for me and what works for a lot of people that I know who sort of really like it and really enjoy programming at this point is, not getting burnt out on overly, it's the wrong place to say it, overly academic parts of the computer science. And, it really comes down to the stuff, for me it was about, playing with things that were fun. It was things like, oh, look, I want to write a game, or I want to do this thing, or hey, there's a tiny little app I could write that no one else in the world is ever going to want, but it's really fun for me, and I can use it to be useful. And just starting to play with things, and especially play with things in sort of your own setting. I remember doing an internship, 16, 17 years ago, and the internship was interesting and the work was fun, but on the side, I was doing this other thing for fun, and I learned so much more just working on my own. Actually, I was working with one friend of mine, because we had to learn everything. We had to understand how all the different components worked. We had to understand how to start from scratch. We had to understand all these different pieces. And I think once you start understanding all the little pieces and what it means, build an iPhone app, build an Android app, what does it actually take? To download this, that is the stuff that actually ends up staying with you. And it's not those specific skills, it's learning how to do it, learning how to sort of go explore. And it's kind of cool now because you've got, the internet and Google. You can find the answer to almost any question you want very quickly. But also the internet's very big. And so learning how to find the right things, learning sort of the right way you do things. And if you look at sort of engineers that I know, some of them are very much they're going to go pick up a book and read the book, and then they're going to sort of do the exercises, and that's fine for some people. Other people are I'm going to go write 5 lines of code and see what happens, and then I'm going to write 5 more lines of code and see what happens then. And when it breaks, I'm going to go to the internet and try to figure out why it broke. And both are completely valid in my mind, but everyone's going to be a little bit different in how they pick up these things and how they learn these things. And I think the key for me is learning how you learn best.
What would you be focusing on today if you could reset?
If I could reset today, I think, I think some of the interesting things, over the next, 5, 10, 20 years is, obviously sort of the popular stuff people are talking a lot about right now is sort of AI is a pretty big one. Augmented reality is pretty interesting. I tend to be a little bit more focused on the back of the world, sort of how to make all these things work really well. Things I'm really interested in are, there's a lot of data out in the world, how do you make it accessible? And especially in the world we live in today, everything is mobile, everyone's got a phone, everyone is traveling all over the world, everyone wants to be everywhere, and everyone wants everything right now. And how do you make things accessible, and how do you make knowledge accessible? to people. There's this other company that I know, I'd love to spend more time with, and what they're trying to do is analyze text. And analyze text in a way that tells you if it's good, what it's trying to teach you. Again, the internet's a vast place. There's millions of articles on any topic you want. But how do you know if it's a good article? How do you know if the information is accurate? How do you, find the right thing? If you want to find the best article on, art, on Beethoven, how do you know what that is? Is it Wikipedia? Or is it some crazy guy who lives in the middle of nowhere who happens to be the world's expert on Beethoven? How can you possibly know that as sort of a novice? And I think that's going to be a really interesting challenge, is sort of understanding information, and how do you make computers understand what information really is and use that to do interesting things.
Sounds like the next evolution of like what Google did, right? Because PageRank, what Google's initial secret sauce for search was just like judging sites based on how many people link back to it. So that was cool in the 90s. This sounds like a really good way to judge it moving forward at some point.
Yeah, and if you think about knowledge, if you think about why, if you think about interesting things like the when you try to do speech recognition on your phone, like it's getting pretty good. But the reason why it's not great is not because the algorithms for doing the speech recognition aren't great. The problem is that the reason why humans are so good at this is that they understand what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And if you're talking about art, you know the different types, you know the different terms about art. You know who the people are. You can sort of bring that information, and so you're thinking about it all at the same time. Computers can't really do that very well. They're just looking at each word, each sound, very independently. And if you can solve that problem, you can really sort of change the way computers work.
Gotcha. Alan, what would your advice be?
Yeah. So a couple things come to mind. I think if you're interested in software development, there are a couple different ways you can go. So there's kind of like the back-end systems route. So things like MongoDB, the other things that facilitate the technology that a lot of things are built on. That part of the tech world has grown for sure. But where the explosive growth has been is in like sort of user-facing systems, so like the app economy and like Web 2.0, as they used to call it, like interactive web services. And they're very different routes you can go, and there's certainly a mix between the two. But I think that both routes offer something a little bit different. If you are really interested in like the academic aspect of things, like back-end systems can be really a really cool way to go. I think I've had the good fortune of being able to get a good mix of both sides of that. But you can also, if you're less interested in like the kind of the more abstract technical details, more user-facing application development is also a good way to go. I think it has a reputation, the software world has a reputation of being like extremely technical in this thing that you can only do if you like are really good at mathematics. And I think that while that may have once been largely true, it's increasingly untrue because the on-ramps have never been easier to be able to do a little bit of coding. Like you can open the developer tools on your web browser with like 2 clicks and immediately start playing with the JavaScript that's on a web page, start changing the colors of things, moving things around. So it's never been easier to get started, and if you're really interested in the user-facing side of things especially, it's pretty easy to do. And the other thing that I wanted to touch on too, because you also asked like if I could look at it like from a perspective of if I were a teenager again. I've thought about that a lot, and I look back, and when I was like 14, 18, even 21, I really had no idea what, there's no way I could have guessed where I would be today. So I really recommend just being really open to the possibilities, because you really can't plan your path. Like you can open as many doors and you can learn as much as you can. But as far as like the details of like, what your first job is going to be and what it's going to be like and where you go from there, I really just recommend being super open to the possibilities rather than trying to pre-plan like your entire life. Just take it one step at a time.
Who does that in
really
high school? Come on.
What's that?
Who does that in high school? Nobody has that.
But I do think that
so
there's like this impression that like, once you're like 30 and you appear to be like doing well, that you had a plan from the start,
right.
And that's from my experience, that was completely not. Like,
Everybody
how it
really
worked out
likes
for
the
me.
plan, like when you're writing your biography or whatever. It's like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
you knew exactly what you're doing. But most people don't. Like that's something important to know, especially right now, like as you're going into college and thinking about your majors and that sort of thing. Like how, was that important to you guys? Like your majors, did you actually end up using what you started out doing in college?
In the end, yes, but I was not planning on being a CS major when I went to college.
Right.
I had very different thoughts about what I was going to be doing, and it completely shifted multiple times actually. Definitely had no idea I would end up doing this.
What were you planning before CS?
Before CS, what I really wanted to do was go work for NASA building spaceships.
Oh dude, that's great. Yeah.
So I thought that would be kind of fun. But then
They need help.
That seemed pretty hard, and I don't know, it seemed a lot more fun. One of the
There's
cool
still
things
time.
one of the things about CS that's really cool, at least for me, is if you build a spaceship or you're working on anything that area, you may start a project and you're working on something for like 5 years before you even get to test it. And the great thing about computers is like programs. Let's say you go build an app, right? You can build an app and in an hour you can see it. You're not gonna be done in an hour, but you can sort of like, hey, I'm doing something. This is kind of real. And then a few days later, you can go like show a friend of yours, and it's like, wow, this is something. And it may not be great, but it's like you built it, you can use it, and it's like doing something that's kind of cool that you care about. And there's no sort of there's very few other things where the immediate gratification, where the sort of ability to try something, iterate on it, is as powerful as it is in software.
And you guys brought up some interesting things about like side projects and kind of the other things you were working on. I think you guys, the kids, like you're in a really good position now because there's so many resources and so many things available to you. What advice would you give to somebody who just like wants to start building an app or start some sort of cool web portal or something?
I mean, for me, it comes down to, find something that, the way I've always thought of it is what is annoying to me? What could I do? What annoys me on a
What could you
day-to-day
fix?
basis that
Yeah.
I can make better for myself?
Yeah.
And that's usually been the start of a lot of my side projects. So this is annoying to me. If I had this, it would make my life a little bit easier or more fun or more entertaining.
That's, by the way, the story of many, many startups. Like if you guys are interested in things like even Google or even like other things, like Google didn't start out as like being this big ambitious thing. It started small and kind of grew up, but yeah.
Yeah, and that's sort of the start. I mean, if you don't care about it, it's very hard to spend time on it. But if you actually care about it because you care about the end result, it's very easy to spend time on it and actually learn things.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think it's almost like a mindset of, I think a lot of people are annoyed by like many things in like their daily life, and it never occurs to them that like, that some of those things have like solutions. So I think it's worthwhile to adopt that mindset of like, yeah, actually I could change this, and maybe maybe if I can put something on my phone to help me do something, like, I guess this isn't so much a New York problem, like, and I guess it is if you do have a car in New York and you park it like, blocks away and you forget where you parked it, like, wouldn't it be cool if you could just like, if there was a really easy way to mark where you left your car so you don't go like searching for it for hours. Things like that, like the annoyances of life, there's tons of opportunity out there, and like either from like a business perspective or just like as a hobbyist, just scratching the itch that you have.
I think the key for me is like the car one's a good one. Like, it doesn't matter if there's like, maybe there's a way you can do it with Google, or maybe it's not going to be like this really cool app. But if it's still annoying you, and it's still useful just to do it, because you'll actually learn how to do it, you'll learn something, you'll have fun, and it'll be something interesting that you care about. So even if it's not this like big ambitious idea, still do it.
Yeah, I think one of the easiest ways to get started or to experiment with software is with like the web browser, because it does have like a programming language built in. They're really cool sites like JS Fiddle, and there's CodePen that lets you like immediately just put in like HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and start messing with things right away. I wish I knew like a good resource that kind of like exemplifies like how you can use those tools to like get your start.
There are many. There are so many. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, when I started, it was like a lot more difficult to figure out like where do you get a C compiler. Like it took me like over a year to figure that out. And now it's the tools are much easier to get a hold of, and much more accessible too.
Gotcha. Ellen, you mentioned that there are a lot of places in the world for people to be in tech now, even without doing like the hardcore, crazy programming and being heavy duty on math and stuff. What sort of roles are you guys seeing coming out there? Because you could think about like Steve Jobs, right, versus Steve Wozniak. Steve Jobs, not a coder, not an engineer, but that's a very specific and very interesting product mind, and that's a different sort of thing to look at too. But you still have to know a little bit of like how computers work and everything.
Yeah, certainly the product roles are really crucial for that. I think one of the things that people are finding is that some of the best companies and the best software are things that like make people's lives easier and help simplify what's kind of like an increasingly complex world. So when I think about like when my parents were my age, they paid like far fewer bills than I have to pay. They didn't have like cable. I think credit cards were just becoming popular, like cell phones. Like we're kind of surrounded by complexity, and it can be pretty overwhelming. And I think that a lot of the apps that turn out to be really successful are things that like make that easier. When you think about like WhatsApp, it seems like a really simple thing, but especially for people who are in places where the countries are much smaller, and like texting people like across national borders is like a huge pain and a big expense. Something like WhatsApp makes a lot of sense because it's simplified like the work of figuring out how to do that. And I think that that's where the tremendous growth in technology has been, is like less so in like like the big, like there's a new computer type. Yeah, that happens. Like that happened with like smartphones and stuff, but that's a once every several years type thing. Whereas new solutions to solve like kind of everyday problems are something that like there's thousands of those, thousands of new apps every single day or new websites.
Gotcha. Who here uses WhatsApp? Not big in New York. Wow. Okay. WhatsApp's very interesting just because you guys should look into this because, it's a small company that Facebook bought them last year or a couple years ago for a lot of money. But it's still run by a couple dozen people. They have like servers like in a couple countries and they have to move things around a lot too. So it's like a very stripped down affair. And then this week they just flipped on encryption for all text chats. That's something Facebook hasn't done, even though Facebook owns them. Google hasn't done it. But it's interesting that a small team can do something like that, very easily. That's very complicated, where the big boys kind of haven't yet. Okay, let's open this up for questions because we have around 15 minutes left. If you guys have any questions for our panelists, just raise your hand. Go ahead.
So what was the project that you did as a kid? Can you explain that introduced you to the
we can repeat the questions. So the question is, what was the first project I did as a kid? The first project I did was basically a very small arcade game, spaceship flying around, shooting other spaceships. It wasn't very exciting, but it was in the early 80s. There weren't a lot of other, there wasn't a lot else to do. And then I did a lot of like text adventure games because, I was a little kid and that's what I liked doing. I think I wrote a computer version of Monopoly when I was a little kid. It was mostly games. Frankly, it was mostly games. I did at one point in elementary school write this utterly trivial application for my mom's office to like print out a series of numbers in this weird way like on a piece of paper, something very trivial. But I can say that was my first official job as a software engineer.
Nice.
I think I got like $10. It was pretty exciting.
Any more questions? Sure. Go ahead and speak up.
What do you do to inspire creativity in your projects?
So the question is, what do you do to inspire creativity? You mean now, currently in my current job, or in general?
In general.
So in general, I would say it really comes down to, being passionate about something. If you don't care about what you're working on, if you don't care about the end result, it's very hard to be creative. If you care about the end result, then you can, talk to users, you can brainstorm, you can do a bunch of things, because you actually are engaged, you're focused on it, you're working on it. Which is why I think it's so important to find something that you find a side project, find a project that you really care about, right? And whatever it is. In some ways, because technology and software is so pervasive now, anything you're interested in, there's often a software twist to it. So it really is, whatever interests you, whether it's sports or art, it doesn't really matter. Just find the thing you actually care about, and then the creativity kind of comes from there.
Yeah, and I think once you do have something that you care about, I think, again, as a reaction against like the idea that software engineering is like this like very technical, methodical exercise. I personally find that like the actual process of writing code tends to be very creative, and there's a lot of different approaches to things, and I find it very gratifying for a lot of the same reasons I find like playing music gratifying. But yeah, I think caring about the outcome is a big part of, caring about the process that leads to that outcome too.
Any more questions? Go, keep going. Yeah.
How did you transition from like making your own programs, to make your life easier, to like working in a job?
You mean like what actually happened, or how did the skills transfer?
Experience, like was it easy to transition to a job?
So I mean, if the question is it really to sort of become an adult and like stop being in school and get a real job and like have to like make money? No, that's not easy. That's a big transition. But it's the same skills, right? And if you enjoy the work, I enjoyed software engineering, so it wasn't sort of that hard. But definitely the hard transition going from college, where it's pretty nice and easy, to the real world where you have to pay rent every month and go to work every morning and show up on time, and it's definitely a transition.
Every company's different too. So you may find companies that are very like strict and very formal in terms of how they, deal with things. I've worked a lot with people at IBM who are just like, they can't be as creative and free as they want to. But then there are people at startups like all over the place. You go to a startup office, and I'm sure you guys will visit some, and a lot of them are just like college playgrounds almost, like, a cool place to hang out, play video games, but also do your work and think about things. Yeah, any more on that, Alan?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I've kind of worked for bigger companies and medium-sized companies and small companies, and then like my startup, which was just two of us. And I think like, yeah, there's a big variation in like what that culture is like, and different things appeal to different people. A lot of people like the structure of like a larger company, where there aren't like, basic, you're not building the thing as you fly it, and you can plug in a place and have very well-defined roles.
And you have resources.
Yeah,
nice,
and resources for sure. I think that's a big difference. Like from like the startup world, we're often like, you don't have 90% of like what you probably need, like what you think you need and what you probably actually do need, and you just have to make do, and everyone has to do a bunch of things that aren't in their zone of expertise. It can be really exciting, but it can also be very frustrating and very, very challenging. So, I think it depends on personality, like which of those kinds of environments, each individual kind of enjoys and thrives in.
Cool. Any more questions? Come on, guys. Who here is planning to like pursue technology or work in technology after college or after high school? That's good. That's good. Can we talk about like, right up here, since you're right up front, what are you looking at? Or what do you plan to do? Not completely sure. Okay. Are you guys, like, who wants to join a startup? Raise your hands. You guys are in New York. There's a lot going on in startup. Who wants to join a big company? I see. It's funny. It's kind of cyclical, because it used to be, you graduate from college and you join a big company, and then there was a whole like generation, I guess, doing startup stuff for a while. That's very interesting. I'm just wondering, like, what are you guys thinking about? Questions? Yes.
So what do you write about for VR?
For VR, I've been reviewing the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive, both of which came out over the past couple weeks. So you can go read those on Engadget. We have some videos up. VR is very interesting. Is that something, like, have you guys thought about like what that means? Because for me, it's sort of like a big transformational shift, almost as big as like the invention of the internet or the move to smartphones.
For VR, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. I don't.
For art, it's going to be huge.
Yeah. It's not something I personally spend a massive amount of time thinking about, but a lot of people in my company do, because one of the real challenges to selling art is that, especially being that we sell things that are essentially one of a kind, to really experience them, you traditionally have to go in person, and only a handful of people have the resources and time to actually see the art that they may be thinking about like purchasing or even just experiencing, you know, like some of the world's best art is in the Louvre in France. And if you can't just, you know, jet across the Atlantic to France, it's tough to actually experience that. And so there's a huge amount of interest in use of VR to let people have like at least to get a closer thing to the real world experience of art. I mean, I think people would rightfully argue that, you know, we're a long ways from being able to like fully replace like, you know, standing in front of like a magnificent work of art. But we can get closer and closer, you know, so that people can find like the cost and time versus benefit trade-off that works for them, you know. And for a lot of people, like it's the idea of VR like vastly changes that calculation.
One thing I didn't ask you guys before, how many of you guys are thinking about doing like your own company or your own technology project? Cool. More people than wanted to join startups. That's interesting. That's cool to hear. Yeah, go ahead.
So a concern that I see with like joining a startup is risk and like your confidence in the idea of the company. So like, what are your takes on risk in like startup versus like being in a big company or something?
It's definitely riskier, that's for sure. When I was working on my company Breakers, you know, we just had leftover student loan money, and the plan was to just like try and get some investment, but otherwise run until we were no longer going to be able to pay rent. And that's what we did. I think fortunately in the software world, skills are really transferable. So I knew that, like, you know, being an experienced engineer at that point I was in my career, like, you know, I could land something in a quick amount of time, which I think differentiates like software, especially once you build some job experience. It differentiates it from a lot of other fields where job security is a much, you know, is harder to come by. But, you know, I do advocate, like, to the extent that you can, you know, taking those risks. It's like, I look at it as like, you know, it was either like a time period that I really didn't make any money and it only cost me money, but you can also look at it as like one of the cheapest MBAs you can get, like actually doing it and trying to, you know, start.
Would you want to go to business school, like, since you've already gone through that?
Well, you know, if I had my way, I would do nothing but master's degrees for the rest of my life. If I had infinite money. So
I hear that from a lot of kids. Yeah.
You know, I would say the risk is actually getting less and less all the time for two big reasons. One is I hire a lot of engineers, and people who have done startups, who have sort of either started them themselves or been in a 4-person startup, they just have a very different skill set than other people. Like if you work at Google for 4 years, or you like work at a bunch of tiny startups for 4 years, you know very different things. And there are fewer people who have the startup experience, so they can become very valuable. And so it's pretty easy to sort of get a very good job after that if the startup doesn't work out. And two, there are so many incubators and so many things popping up all over the place that, you know, it's not so much, you know, it's getting easier and easier to take that risk because the risk is just less, right? You can get, you know, get some money, get people to like pay for space, you know, all those sorts of things. So I think the risks are getting less and less over time. You know, 10 years ago, it was sort of like, all right, people weren't really sure where it's going, but I think over time it really is less and less risky.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's really nice about it is because you have to do so much, especially when it's just you or you and like a small other group of people, it's a great way to figure out what aspects of that of a company you actually like enjoy. Because I think compared to some of like my internships where I really had no, you know, it's like you show up and then they have a project for you and you don't really get a lot of say in it. And you don't get a huge amount of exposure to like the breadth of like what's going on across the company. You know, it was a chance to really figure out like, you know, because you're forced to do everything, you figure out which things you really are good at. But I do want to acknowledge that it's like definitely like a privilege to be able to take that risk as well. I think I was fortunate that I had enough like student loan money in the bank to be able to give myself a few months of runway to do that. And, you know, so I recognize that not everyone is going to get that opportunity for sure.
All right. One thing before we finish up here, are you guys aware of what happened in the 90s in New York and the tech scene and everything? Because this whole new startup wave, it's not a new thing for New York. So there's a movie I'd recommend everybody check out. It's called We Live in Public. It's a documentary about like the 90s tech scene in New York. It's insane. It's crazy. Like a startup guy opened up basically a bunker in Soho and like invited people to live there for 30 days, and they'd be recorded all the time. And it's really interesting to see that happening in the 90s versus today. They ended up like stockpiling guns and stuff, and the police had to like shut them down. But just watch that, and you could see like what the tech community used to be like in New York, and maybe you'll be tempted to like try to help change things here. All right, let's have a round of applause for our panelists. Thanks, guys.